Thank you, Aura, for sponsoring today's video. We have an obsession with forgotten places. From TikTok parkour sleuths and speculative documentaries to whole genres and subgenres within horror, science fiction, and fantasy. We, as a human race, are fascinated by places and things that have been abandoned. When I was in college working on one of my first stories, a way too ambitious post-collapse epic set within North America, I was utterly fascinated with the fallout and abandonment of a relatively large city located in northern Ukraine, near the Belarus border in what was then the Soviet Union, Pripyat. The event that caused this city to become abandoned, to be totally vacated, with its inhabitants seemingly leaving everything they've ever owned and cared about overnight, was due to the catastrophic failure and explosion that occurred within reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Pripyat and the Chernobyl disaster have inspired dozens of stories that feature abandoned cities and apocalyptic settings. What became of this city is fascinating and haunting and tragic. But it isn't the first city to have been abandoned, and it certainly won't be the last. The things and places that get left behind are sometimes the most important bit of world building we can do. Abandoned places are the source of mystery, the root of history, and a cracked window into the future. All across our world, there are abandoned places that have been left behind for a reason. Some explained, and others something that we are still trying to fully understand. Fictional stories are similar in that regard. I remember the rabbit hole that I started to go down after first starting my armchair analysis and research into the Chernobyl disaster. And I became fascinated with questions like, what would happen if everyone left X city or X region? But what became an equally interesting question was also, what would happen when those people come back? Or who is coming back? And even, how does this void impact them and the area around it? And I've noticed that a lot of my favorite stories seem to be inspired by these what-if scenarios and abandoned places in general. The Southern Reach trilogy's tower, as described by the biologist in the first book, seems like a spiraling descent down into Portugal's Sintra well. The leftovers examine the psychological effects of the rapture, an event in which 2% of the world's population vanished. There are also the Fallout games and the TV show where the world is set within a post-apocalyptic America where a new evolution or even de-evolution of civilization begins to grow out of and around the husk of this familiar old world. But even fantasy and horror genres used abandoned locations, forgotten places, and artifacts that have been left behind as keystone world-building features, being the source of unexplained magic, unimaginable horrors, and an undeniable sense of curiosity. Abandoned places and forgotten things are so important when it comes to world building. But it isn't always and necessarily about the abandoned place or the items that have been left behind themselves, but rather the why. Why is this place abandoned? Who used to live here and use these things? What was left behind and what wasn't left behind? And why is this place avoided or sought after to begin with? It's these questions and this line of thinking that really makes forgotten places so important. Because although they are abandoned now, they weren't always abandoned before. And we can't exactly have abandoned places and things without the breakdown of empires, nations, states, cities, and altogether civilized things. These collapses are usually categorized, caused, and framed within apocalyptic events. Wars and invasions, natural and man-made disasters, societal and governmental decay, and in some cases, mass unexplained exoduses. Their flight a mystery, leaving very little in terms of evidence or data of who these people were, how and where they lived, and what they were like. However, there are times where we want information and data like that to be forgotten, or at least not shared around the world without our consent. I remember last year in April 2024 when the National Public Data lost almost 3 billion records. In one of the largest data breaches of all time, hackers stole the sensitive information of billions of people, including full names, addresses, birth dates, and social security numbers. This sort of apocalyptic breach is something that today's sponsor, Aura, takes very seriously. Data breaches are frustrating and incredibly harmful, and sometimes you don't even know that your personal data has been leaked until well after the damage has already been done. Aura is an all-in-one digital protection service that is there to help keep you safe. As someone who works online and basically lives online, I do love a few specific features that they offer. Their data broker opt-out feature removes your personal information from data brokers and people search sites that can sell your info to identity thieves, scammers, and more. There's also the financial protection fraud feature where you can be alerted and Aura will take action within minutes when your credit file has been compromised, like if someone tries to open a credit card or a loan within your name. But two of my favorite features are their VPN and their password protection feature. Aura's VPN protects your internet connection with military-grade encryption. It also blocks known scams and phishing sites for added protection. With 100+ virtual locations, you can access global content safely. And the password manager lets you store and access your online passwords securely and conveniently across many apps. That way, you know that where you keep your work and your personal records will remain safe and secure. And I get all of this and more in an all-in-one app at an affordable price. I'm not leaving myself and my family vulnerable to data breaches and brokers. And if you don't want to either, you can go to Aura and try 2 weeks for free. That will be enough time for Aura to find out if any of your personal data has been exposed. Use the QR code on screen or check out the link down below. Thank you again to Aura for sponsoring today's video. But this question and the mystery of all that data, or lack thereof, that has been left behind fuels the curiosity and interest with these abandoned places. Whether it be a home in the woods, a collapsed chapel on the outskirts of town, or an entire city that has been abandoned, these places say something about the people who came before us. There's something so haunting and beautiful and powerful about physically being able to see the places where these people used to live and the things that they used in their lives. Broadly speaking, history is just a collection of names and dates and places pieced together into a mosaic that tells a story, a way to look at and picture the way that people's lives worked and what their lives were like back then. The process of answering the question, where do we come from, is one that people have been asking and trying to understand forever. And sometimes these forgotten places or the forgotten items are sometimes all that there is to go off of. When the Neo-Assyrian Empire fell, after controlling all of Mesopotamia, the Levant, and Egypt, as well as parts of Anatolia and Arabia, the fractured city-states and empires that came after wondered what great beings and gods built these cities and monuments that are now abandoned. The generations of Medes and Babylonians that conquered the Assyrian heartland, raising many of these monuments, places, temples, and cities, wrote after rediscovering some of these once great places that they were now ruins. Most of the once greatest empire was now abandoned, with no one to return to any of its cities or capitals, with the exception of a few settlements. Similar feelings can be seen echoing throughout history. Pompeii, after the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, was never resettled. Coleman Scott in Namibia, after German settlers exhausted the gem mines, became a ghost town. And at the time, the most densely populated place on Earth, Hashima Island, or Battleship Island, was abandoned when Japan's energy needs shifted. And what is interesting to ask is, what do these places say? What themes or messages can we take away from them? What can we learn? For the Assyrians, perhaps this is a lesson in ultimate power corrupting ultimately. When all that power is centralized, if a clear leader is not supported or that power cannot be maintained, you get a swift and dramatic fall. But it is hard to tell, as modern scholars are still trying to understand why this class was so swift and so violent. For Pompeii, perhaps it was punishment from the gods, a warning to the Roman Empire. And for Hiroshima and Coleman Scott, it is a result from an industrial age and exhausting natural resources. An environmentalist warning, perhaps, and a warning about colonialism, and a stark reminder of the World War II labor camps under Japanese authority. But this is real history, and it's never always as neat or as clean as we would sometimes like it to be. Fictional worlds, however, can be these representations of themes and ideas and a message. But depending on the fictional worlds that you create, abandoned places can still be a way to explore what the past was like. These places start to build that outline of what things were like, who used to live there, and what was important to them. It's a corridor of gallery walls with little images and still frames captured from a moment in time. It is like understanding the backstory of a character. Little trigger points to come up later and reveal themselves. Who was here before? What did they leave behind? And what was life like before now? And I love these sorts of questions because they act like a catalyst to put the forgotten places at the forefront of the story. For instance, in the game Outer Wilds, these questions are what motivates the central mystery of the game. Who was here before is one of the main drivers as we explore ancient ruins and decipher a lost language, trying to figure out why we are stuck in this time loop. If any game could truly encapsulate the curiosity of uncovering a galactic puzzle, this game does just that. As you explore the different parts of the planets in the solar system and expand your little cork board, you continue to unlock more mysteries and more theories, all while trying to find the answer to the question, who was here before us? What did they leave behind? And even what their purpose was. But in Cormac McCarthy's The Road, there's a void when we ask the question, what did they leave behind? Because the world that he creates is one that is desolate, abandoned, filled with ash. In The Road, there is almost an absence of mystery. Everything has either already been looted, gone to waste, or simply returned to the earth. There's a compiling loss of hope. There's this gamble when going into a house or venturing off the road or even staying on the road. Everything is dangerous. The world has been abandoned, and a boy and his father continue down it, looking for the other good guys in a world where there is nothing good left to speak of. And we can think of other stories as well that might reflect the differences between the old and the new world, either being something that is reminiscent of an older time and nostalgic for that sort of past, or maybe even a way to sort of distance themselves from a more shameful past, reflecting on how good or bad things used to be. But myths and legends and raw historical events really start to take shape when we ask, where do we come from? World building around this question and forgotten places is like planting small seeds to grow out from. This part of world building is one that I think fills us with the greatest sense of wonder and awe, looking at the world we created or even a world we are interacting with, and getting the chance to ask who lives there or what happened to X. This is a part of world building that makes you feel like a kid again almost. The curiosity that comes with looking at a map you've created or perhaps someone else's and seeing a random location and wanting to explore it. It is a wonderful feeling. It's the same feeling I get when I look down into Portugal's Sintra as well, or that pit of fear I got when I was a kid exploring a tomb in Morrowind. These abandoned places and forgotten artifacts lay the groundwork for all the data that will influence the present-day world building and the potential mysteries within your world. This is the really exciting part of shaping a fictional world, because we get to create and hide those small, intricate details that sometimes get lost to time. And I know I mentioned a lot of big things that have been left behind: monuments, cities, powerful artifacts. But in your story, and in terms of world building, it can sometimes be the smallest things that speak the loudest. A photograph forgotten in an attic, the silhouette of ash on a wall, or a letter in a footlocker that was left unfinished.
Maybe it will make you happy. Throw it away, please.
The past is messy and fractured and half-written. The forgotten things in your world should reflect that. They should invite the audience to try and finish what remains unfinished, because that will then begin to answer the next question. How did we get here? When we think about where we come from, that question usually leads to several other questions that rarely get a clear and concise answer. But the one that might be the most important to then consider, especially when it comes to the actual story that this world is taking place within, is how did we get here? The question of how did we get here is critical to understand and at least ask when it comes to a story, because it represents the psychology of the characters and people who are occupying these stories present day. World building is fun, but when we are implementing it into a story, it needs to be a bonus to it. And using abandoned places or fragments of the past to help with the story can be a huge boon, adding tension, conflict, and mystery. And this is where a different sort of fun begins to take shape, and where the elements of world building can offer a great deal of creativity and freedom, linking the world's past to its present. It is the contextualization of the past events within the world that makes this such a useful element. I've been watching the second season of Silo, and the use of abandoned places and things is used all throughout the story. It creates a ton of tension through the laws and the different dynamics around the artifacts and the denied areas. It says so much about the way the characters interpret the world and the difference between the old world and this new world within the silo. And these objects, these artifacts, are at the center of the main story's mystery and conflict. The laws around relics cause a great deal of conflict. And also the abandoned parts of the silo or denied areas of the silo offer a great deal of mystery. But the silo's use of artifacts is a way to world build within the silo and outside of it. It's a very active way to both world build and craft conflict in a story. Another thing that we can really do some serious world building when it comes to our story is to use these forgotten places almost to frame and set the stage for the rest of the world. And this will probably be a bit more intuitive, but I think doing it deliberately and with intention will make your world building and world building in general that much more immersive. For instance, let's say that we have an empire that has collapsed, and many kingdoms, petty kingdoms, and independent states have come into existence because of it. In this, the different groups might revere or begin to worship the places and objects left behind by the past empire. This is very common when it comes to weapons or technology. Other groups might fiercely want to distance themselves from the past, while others might have no memory or history at all, looking at the leftover places with wonder or fear or casual indifference. And although abandoned places and artifacts might not play a huge central role to your story, something or someone existed before that story. Understanding how the people in your world got to where they are creates the stage that your story is going to sprout from. Depending on your story and what is relevant to the present interpretation of the what that came before, we can create a great deal of conflict with our world building. There can be conflict in the ownership of places or objects like in Silo or even in the Fallout universe. Historical consensus might also not fully be found, leading to historical revisionists missing segments of the past or the misinterpretation of places, people, beings, and things. This can build legends and mythology around abandoned places. But we can also consider the change that has occurred. What has changed from the past to the present and why? This can create a lot of psychological and social conflict seen throughout your world. And it should be noted as well that world building should always service the story. Unless, of course, we are just world building for the sake of world building. Different mediums will use world building differently. The way that you world build in a novel will be different the way that you might world build for a video game or a D&D campaign or even for a film or a TV show. However, regardless, abandoned places are a good way to world build and to show the audience how people used to live back then and how people live and interact with the world today. But it also does a good job of creating conflict and mystery and depth to your world. Although abandoned places tell us about the past and contextualize the present, they offer a great deal of insight into the future. We need to remember that why a place is abandoned is usually due to some sort of collapse. And we should also remember that collapse is complicated. Collapse can happen due to a number of things, or a combination of things. Disease, famine, wars, invasions, natural disasters, man-made disasters, economic collapses, environmental collapses, and societal collapses are all fine examples that you can use. And all of these might even be relevant to explore within your world. But think about how this further enhances the themes and conflict within a narrative. What caused a place to be abandoned can be a powerful storytelling device. In The Mountain and the Sea, so much of the world has been left barren and abandoned, replaced by autonomous beings and advanced AIs. Themes of climate change, overfishing, and shady corporate operations are reflected in the fishless oceans and denied archipelago, where the story primarily takes place. And these themes come out and are enhanced by the world building done to the setting and these abandoned locations. And one of the more abstract sort of concepts in the broad school of world building is creating conflict within your world building, or reflecting conflict, and maybe these stories conflict with your world building. We see this though in Game of Thrones, with the harsh winters being a thematic representation of climate change and being the true threat. In Mad Max, the post-apocalyptic wasteland drives the central conflict, being one of control over scarce resources and a fight for freedom and survival. And in Children of Men, the world is plagued by infertility, where societal collapse appears to be inevitable, and all hope seems to be lost. But in games like Shadow of the Colossus and Dead Space, the setting, one being a lost and forgotten world, and the other being an abandoned space station, almost becomes the main conflict, central to the story and the game itself. And this is really why abandoned places matter so much when it comes to world building. The warnings and the themes that we can illustrate to the audience and even to the other characters makes these forgotten places matter so much. Although using conflict and themes in your world building might feel abstract or ham-fisted, but in reality, it really is just a sign of good storytelling. We want the world to say something, to foreshadow something, to have some kind of meaning and make us think and reflect. When we look at an abandoned city in the middle of the desert, that has an effect on us. When we walk through a neighborhood filled with foreclosure signs and vacancy notices, that makes us feel something too. And when we see the dystopian photographs of a Ferris wheel covered in algae and vines, or a school with textbooks and backpacks still occupying empty desks, we have to ask, where did everyone go? What happened? Who used to live here? But let me know what you think. Are world building abandoned places something that you find helpful and useful, or even interesting when they are present in other stories? Thank you again to Aura for sponsoring today's video, and thank you to the channel members. Happy New Year, everybody. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.